Hello, I'm Bruce Eisner, and the title of my talk today is The History and Future of LSD. For those of you who don't know my background, I've written one book which I spoke on the topic of yesterday, Ecstasy, the MDMA Story. However, I've been a journalist in the area of consciousness, coverage of events like this, psychoactive compounds, and so forth for 30 years. And I also have a background in psychology, just short my dissertation for my doctorate from Seabrook Institute. So I mix psychology, journalism, and I've always had a very avid interest in psychoactive compounds, psychedelics, entheogens, what you like to call them, since my first experience, which was 35 years ago in 1967. So I was part of that hippie generation, and I was a very active participant back then. The reason I chose the title, The History and Future of LSD, rather than something like The History and Future of Entheogens or The History and Future of Psychedelics, was because I have a particular belief that each of the compounds is very distinct, psychoactive compounds that are related to alteration of consciousness. Some people call them the hallucinogens, some people call them the psychedelics, and so forth. Each one of them is very unique. One of the characteristics of the LSD molecule in terms of pharmacology is that different parts of the molecule actually mimic several different other categories of psychoactive compounds. For instance, one part of the LSD molecule is very much like a phenethylamine. I don't know if any of you have read the books Phenethylamines I've Known and Loved, or Bicol, which lists about 420 of them by Sasha Alexander Shulgin and Anne Shulgin. But there's literally hundreds of those that are psychoactive, the prototype being mescaline. And the other part of the ring is a tryptamine portion, and there's another book by Sasha Shulgin called Tryptamines I've Known and Loved, or Tikal, and the lysergic acid molecule, of which LSD is prototypical, has both of those. And in terms of psychoactivity, it makes it the prototype of psychedelic or entheogenic compounds. Now, I want to go a little bit into the real ancient history of these lysergic acid molecules, which actually have some relevance to when I talk about the future of these things. The earliest uses of them, surprisingly enough, it just came out about maybe 23 years ago, was in the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was a mystery school in ancient Greece about between the 2nd and the 3rd century BC. And what the Eleusinian Mysteries were basically that a lot of the citizens of Athens would take a pilgrimage to a temple called the Temple of Eleusius, and they would be guided through a series of events which led to them encountering the Oracle of Delphi. And so it was a very carefully orchestrated event, and what Carl Ruck, Albert Hoffman, and Gordon Wasson wrote about in a book called The Road to Eleusius, which was published about 25 years ago and just recently reprinted, so it is in print, was that they have discovered that there was a particular, now ergot itself, I'm going to take a little aside here. Ergot is, there's several different species of them. There's the most common one that people know about is Claviceps purpurea, which grows on barley and it's spread all through Europe. And the most noteworthy thing about it is that it would infect fields of grain in the Middle Ages, and they would bake it into bread, and people would have these scourges called the St. Anthony's fire, where it was actually very toxic, and it would constrict their blood vessels. Sometimes their extremities would fall off. There was people who died, people who went kind of crazy. Some people even had spiritual experiences as part of those. But it was, that was Claviceps purpurea. But there's another kind of ergot. Now, ergot is a little, it looks like, it's a fungus. It looks like a little tiny mushroom if you look at it in a microscope. It looks like a little tiny mushroom that grows on the grain. And it's the stuff that contains the alkaloids, the ergot alkaloids. And this particular, there's another kind that grows all through the grasses. They're called the pospili grasses, Paspalus dictum, which grows all through Greece and the Mediterranean area. And this has it's Claviceps pospili. They call it Claviceps pospili. And it turns out that that particular kind of ergot doesn't produce the St. Anthony's fire. It's not toxic. And it is very similar in structure to LSD. And so one of the things that people didn't realize until the book by Hoffman and Ruck and Watson was published was that actually as part of this Eleusinian mystery, they gave people a bowl of, that contained diffusion of Claviceps pospili. There was also some variants of it. Some people said they made a water infusion of the other stuff. But in any event, that along with this very carefully guided experience would often lead to an experience of illumination. And people had these experiences once in a lifetime, and they would come back, but it influenced an awful lot of the amazing flowering of philosophy and so forth, mathematics and all of that happened in Greece because of this connection to the mystical. Now I'm not calling this the history of psychedelics, but just as a historical note, the class of compounds, the plants, including mushrooms and barks and so forth, have been used by humans ever since our species began. And some people speculate that the use of psychedelic plants was related to the origin of consciousness or the origin of religion. There's been a variety of people who've talked about that, and so there's a great deal of interest there. Here is a case where Claviceps, and ergot played a part in that history in terms of the Greek religion. But historically, we've always had this relationship. In fact, Ronald K. Siegel, who's a professor of pharmacology at UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, has written a book called Intoxication, in which he says that the drive toward getting high or intoxication he calls it the fourth drive. It's a natural drive, just like the drive to eat, the drive to have sex and procreate, the drive to drink, and so forth. This is an instinctual drive. It's found all through the insects and animal kingdom and so forth. And there's always been this symbiosis or relationship between humans and the plants, and the rise of consciousness, the self-reflective awareness that's so unique to humans may have been in part engendered by the use of these compounds. So let's fast forward a little bit. We go to Greece, and then we've been in the Middle Ages. Well, something else in the Middle Ages that a lot of people don't know about that's related to LSD was that there was a particular compound used by the alchemists, and it was called manna, or oil of manna. And oil of manna was actually an ergot derivative. And so it could be, synchronistically, that this oil of manna led in part to the development of the very, underground at that time, since in the Middle Ages, alchemy was a persecuted area that led to alchemy. And there's kind of a Basel connection here, because Paracelsus, who was the most noteworthy alchemist, lived in Basel. Carl Jung grew up in Basel and wrote many books and papers about the history of alchemy, as well as giving us maps to self-actualization and growth. And then a lot of the work that was done with these ergot derivatives was done in Basel as well. Matter of fact, a lot of the discoveries that led up to the discovery of LSD happened there at Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company. For instance, in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, there was the discovery of this first compound called ergotoxine, which was a organic compound that came from ergot. And then later on, Arthur Stoll, who was later to play a role in the discovery of LSD, developed ergotamine. And ergotamine became a very big drug for Sandoz as a treatment for migraine headaches. And so they felt that the natural plant division of Sandoz was very interested in these ergot plants, and they synthesized a whole variety of variants of these ergots, and then eventually they got into lysergic acid, which was one of the constituents of ergot, and this led to the in 1938 they actually synthesized LSD-25, or D-lysergic acid diethylamide, and they didn't do anything with it, so they just kind of put it on the shelf and forgot about it. And there's kind of an interesting story that Albert Hoffman, who's a very wonderful gentleman, I've had a chance to meet him and bring him here to the United States. I met him in 1976 in Basel. He had this curious, what he called a curious presentiment about this compound that he synthesized 5 years earlier. So he pulled it out and synthesized this series again, and he noticed, for instance, that they would do bird chirping experiments where they give the different things that they synthesized to canaries, and the canaries chirped louder when they got this LSD 25, the 25th synthesis of these ergot compounds. And so one day while he was synthesizing it, some of it accidentally got through his skin, and of course there's the famous story of the bicycle ride. Does anybody not know that story? Basically what happened was he felt ill. He thought he was getting the flu or something, so he asked Stoll, his assistant, to accompany him home on bicycles. That's how they got around Basel at that time. And as he was bicycling home, everything started going in slow motion, and so he had this experience, which was very short-lived. He called a medical doctor, but it wore off very quickly because the amount that went through his skin was so small. But being a curious scientist, he decided, well, I'll do a self-experiment. And so 3 days later, this was April 16th, 1943, was when the bicycle event occurred. And you also have to note that this is right around the same time that in New Mexico, atomic scientists are looking for a way to develop nuclear fission, and which led to the atomic bomb. This was a little smaller group of people, but it occurred synchronistically, very close together. In any event, so Hoffman decided to take the smallest amount possible of LSD, and so he decided to take 250 micrograms, which is considered to be almost minuscule, but it turns out that it's a very, very large dose. And then he had the world's first real full-blown LSD trip, which wasn't altogether pleasant with him. Nobody knew anything about this. He thought at some point that he was going crazy. He thought he would never be able to go back to his job or his family, but when he looked at it in retrospect, he decided that it was pretty interesting. And one of the speculations is that he thought that it might have some relevance to mental illness, that because it was so, crazy in a way. Although, if you actually look at what LSD does experientially, it's very different than schizophrenia. For instance, in schizophrenia, there's no usually there's no visual hallucinations. It's mostly auditory. LSD tends to have this effect where there's a synthesia. All the senses are involved: visual, auditory, smell, everything. So it's different, but that was kind of what they were looking at the beginning. They were looking at whether LSD would possibly be a way that they could discover the mechanisms of mental illness. And then, so Sandoz started sending out samples to doctors and researchers and so forth, with the idea that they could eventually market this in some fashion. They also started sending it to therapists. One of the odd things in looking at the literature of it all is that a lot of it went to doctors who try to use it to treat mental patients. I don't know what the theory behind it was. Sometimes it actually worked. There was an early on book by Dr. Sanderson, published in England, in which one of his mental patients, after 18 days of being dosed in a ward, is sitting on the grass watching a grasshopper and shows the doctor the harmony of the universe, and he's discharged and never comes back again, things like that. But there wasn't any real theory behind it. But there actually were literally thousands and thousands of papers. If you look at the Sandoz archives, there's thousands and thousands of papers written about the use of LSD, because for many years it was just completely unknown to the public. Unlike in my talk yesterday when we were talking about ecstasy, and we found that there's hardly anything written about it before or since it was made illegal. There's a huge literature. In fact, the literature practically stops when we move forward in our story a little bit. Well, anyway, now eventually it got to the United States and to Los Angeles and to New York and to some of the big cities, and there was a few articles published about it. And it was really about 1954 with the publication of a book called Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley about an experience on a related compound, mescaline, that I would kind of note as the beginning of what I call the psychedelic movement. Now, if you want to find out in really good detail about this particular part of our history, I would recommend two good books. One book is Storming Heaven, and the other one is Acid Dreams by Storming Heaven's by Jay Stevens, and Acid Dreams is by Marty Kent and Bruce Shane. And both of them have very good accounts of that particular part of the history of it all. And the Shane book focuses in a lot on some of the early work that the CIA and the Army did in attempting to use LSD as a brainwashing drug. And that's one thing you find about psychoactive compounds, is that the intentionality of the use is oftentimes as important as what is given. In other words, some people, immediately see LSD and they think, oh, this is a therapy tool. Some people see it and they think, oh, this is a brainwashing tool, and other people see it and they say, oh, this is a spiritual or self-actualization tool. It's the ethic that goes along with its use is so important. Well, in any event, those two have a history of it, and so what happened is that in the early days, there was kind of several phases of the psychedelic movement. It started out with just very few intellectuals taking LSD. A lot of them were clustered in Los Angeles around Aldous Huxley. Dr. Oscar Janiger, who was a psychiatrist, gave LSD to people like Cary Grant and to some famous artists and so forth. When Houston Smith, who was here, invited Aldous Huxley to give a series of lectures at MIT, Huxley and Osmond went out there and met up with a group of researchers, Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Ralph Metzner, and some of their colleagues who were at Harvard conducting the Harvard psilocybin experiment. And there was quite a bit of interchange between them. Very famous experience that Leary talks about in his book Flashbacks, in which he takes a LSD trip with Aldous Huxley, and there was quite a bit of a disagreement about what should be done about these things. In those days, most of the experiences were positive. Don't forget that most of the compounds were pharmaceutically pure. The people who were taking them were exceptional people, and the word bad trip was hardly even known, although there probably was a few of them. I mean, Hoffman's first trip might have been considered a bad trip, but people for the most part had pretty positive experiences. And Leary developed a hypothesis called set and setting and guide, in which set means the psychological expectations that you go into an experience with. Setting is the environment that you take a compound in. Then, of course, there's other variables like the dosage, the purity of the drug itself, the guide, or the people that you take it with. And all of these variables could be modified to facilitate certain kinds of experiences. So that was observed quite a bit in those early days. And so there was this ivory tower group of people who knew about and took LSD. Leary would fly around with Richard Alpert, who had a private plane and turned on people like the parapsychologist Rhine and his group, and they'd fly to New York and turn on Dizzy Gillespie, and they'd bring the beatniks, poets like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs to their Frank Barron's home in Cambridge and give them guided sessions. Some of this earliest stuff was with the active constituent of mushrooms, magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, which is psilocybin. Now, that's actually another interesting thing that I could bring in here at this point that I left out of the history, but which I think is relevant here, and that is that tangential to this ergot history of LSD, that Albert Hofmann discovered that there were these plants that grew in South and Central America that were species of morning glories. There was Boda Negro. There was a whole variety of these plants, and what they discovered on a trip to gather these seeds was that here a whole different species of the plant kingdom also contained lysergic acid derivatives. So they were in this fungus that grew on grains, and they also were in the magic plants that were used by the Aztecs and by some of the cultures in Central America and South America. Some of these seeds were so big that, unlike the little seeds that people buy from nurseries, and if you ever buy seeds from nurseries, always make sure that they're not treated with poison, because they poison them these days. But it would have to take only 6 or 7 of these, and they would have an experience which was not exactly like LSD, because the molecules weren't exactly like LSD, and there was a lot more rough riding, shall we say. It's nausea and so forth, more characteristic to things like mescaline and peyote than LSD, which tends to be very non-physical in its pure form. So they also went on another journey to see Maria Sabina and discovered that the active ingredient of the mushrooms, so those were Hofmann's 2 big discoveries, besides LSD, was that the magic plants of Central and South America were actually, one was actually related to LSD, and that they were all part of this category of what Osmond and Huxley called the psychedelics, or the soul or mind manifesting compounds. And so we get into this psychedelic movement, which is a very, carefully guarded secret, and there's some people who feel that it should be, of course, Hofmann took LSD after he took it by accident with European intellectuals. He took it, I think, a total of 14 times in his noteworthy book, LSD, My Problem Child, which you can find on the World Wide Web. There was a group of, even at Harvard, Frank Barron, for instance, who had invited Leary and Alpert to lecture at Harvard, felt that it should be kept private. Huxley expressed that opinion on many occasions, although shortly before his death in Copenhagen, he proposed in a public lecture that there might be this mass experiment where people would be given psychedelics on a wide scale. And the reason he gave it was that to cut through the inertia, the mental sludge, he called it, the mental sludge that people have. And that he actually did propose a mass experiment, although, you know, there was quite a bit later that there was a breach between Leary and Huxley, because I was at a dinner once with a lot of the survivors. Osmond was there, Sidney Cohen, who did research at UCLA, who wrote a book about his early studies called The Beyond Within, which was one of the books that inspired me to first try these things. And Leary was there, and Captain Al Hubbard, who's quite a character. Captain Al Hubbard was a very interesting character who recently was part of a novel called Wisdom's Maw, in which also has the as characters the head of the CIA and Ken Kesey, and it's kind of a funny book if you know some of the history of it all. But Captain Al Hubbard always wore a guard uniform, and he had one of the largest, he had accumulated one of the largest quantities of LSD in the world, and was actually responsible for turning on Humphrey Osmond to LSD in the 50s, and developed something called the Hubbard Room, which was how most therapists administered LSD even to this present day. Hubbard Room was a very specially decked out room with the best stereo and you know, beautiful deck that you could walk out on and so forth to create a perfect environment. Hubbard actually started a center in Canada, in Vancouver, that existed as late as the middle 1970s at Hollywood Hospital, where for $600 you could apply and have a session in the Hubbard Room. But when experiments started, they used these Hubbard Rooms in order to create a good setting for the experience, and oftentimes it worked. A lot of the research that was done in the National Institute of Mental Health was done in these same kind of environments, and later on they even brought in music specialists what kind of music you would play at a certain point in the experience to elicit different kinds of things. Well, anyway, so there was this conflict, and there was a conviction among some of the people that, you know, don't forget the context politically of these times. This was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, every day you read Newsweek or U.S. News and World Report, and you saw how many bombs were being aimed at us and how many missiles were being aimed at the Russians. And there was the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists had this clock moving toward midnight where the world would blow itself up. And so that some people felt that the experience that LSD elicited could be something of a political tool. A great story is found in a book published first in the 60s but republished by Ronan called High Priest by Timothy Leary, where they give Allen Ginsberg and his boyfriend Peter Orlovsky an LSD trip, and at the end of the experience he tries to get in touch with Kennedy and Khrushchev, and he wasn't able to connect to either one of them, but he felt that if he told them about this LSD that somehow or other it would avert, you know, the nuclear war. So that it was looked upon by some people as a way of averting nuclear war. And in my way of looking at it, LSD actually became kind of the sacrificial lamb that perhaps saved us from nuclear destruction, but at the same time gave up its reputation because the way it what happened is that Leary, Richard Alpert was terminated from Harvard, and Leary's contract was terminated, and so they went on kind of an excursion trying to find a sanctuary where they could use LSD the way they wanted to. They went to Zanahuatejo in Mexico and started a group there that was based on the novel Island, in which they developed a book based on the Tibetan Book of the Dying called The Psychedelic Experience. And then they were kicked out of Mexico and they went to the Caribbean and eventually got kicked out of there, and ended up that Richard Alpert had a session with a very rich young man named William Ellen Hitchcock, who rented an estate in Millbrook, and for the next 3 years there was a sanctuary where people had the freedom to experiment with these things, and it was very close to New York City and so forth. It was around the same time that our friend Stanley Krippner over here was experimenting at Maimonides, I think. And in any event, eventually, through his proselytizing about LSD, saying that there was they knew that not everybody should take LSD. LSD, and I will tell you that, and that not everybody, LSD is not for everybody. There are cases of people with pre-existing mental disorders that are genetically based. There's people who have a certain kind of personality type. LSD is just not a very good tool for them. Perhaps better if used in a therapeutic context, but the way that it's used these days, it's not for everybody, and it's not even for the majority of people. But it was touted as such, as a way of attempting to cause dissent. I mean, when people took LSD, you have it kind of gives you insight that cuts through the veneer of civilized everyday life, the radio, TV melodrama, and you see things as at a deeper level, and oftentimes that has a politicalizing effect on you. You feel like, oh, they're trying to put one over on me when they do all of these radio broadcasts and so forth. So in any event, it became, until 1964, there was only about 800,000 people who had taken LSD. And now don't forget, most of this LSD was pure LSD that had either leaked out of Sandoz. There was very few underground chemists. One of the first major underground chemist was a fellow who I interviewed recently named Bear Stanley Owsley, who now lives in Australia. And Owsley set up a major production facility for LSD, and at that point the amount of LSD expanded, and it moved from this ivory tower group to very, it was still in a very good group of people. I mean, there were very intelligent college students, very committed people of all ages who observed a lot of the guidelines that were issued, and were very people considered it a spiritual self-actualization tool, and there was a lot of verbal knowledge that was passed along, like having a trained guide, don't pass it to anybody, give it to somebody you know, make sure that you know that the compound is good, and so forth. And so that continued on, but then as things kind of wound up with the war and the manufacture of the underground LSD, which was very good LSD, the stuff that Owsley made is just about as good as the pharmaceutical, if not better. But in those days, people would take, the average dose was 250 micrograms. Every pill that was issued is a large dose and useful in therapy, but still a large dose, and there was definitely bound to be people who took it in the wrong way or took it by accident, and those stories were blown up by the media, and later on, even stories were made up. You know, like one governor of one state said that 5 people had stared at the sun and went blind on LSD, even though later on he admitted that he made it up. But all of these stories caused kind of a big flap, let's get LSD, let's get it off the streets. And so eventually, there were meetings in Congress, and LSD was criminalized around 1966 in California. The day that it was criminalized in California marked the human being, they called it the human being in San Francisco, where all of these young people who had taken psychedelics, the hippies, a lot of them had congregated in San Francisco, and there was a conflict between the two groups of people. Some people felt that LSD should be used as a spiritual tool, and other people felt that it should be used as a political tool, or it shouldn't be used at all because political people shouldn't be wanting to get high. And they all got together at this and it was the gathering of the tribes. And then, of course, LSD was illegal, and it was a whole different ballgame from there. Now, I have a different kind of history of LSD than most people have, and I'm going to kind of bring it out at this point. I told you that I'm giving you the history of the psychedelic movement. Well, I think that when I mentioned Jay Stevens' book, Storming Heaven, that in a way, the book ends in 1970. There's a coda where they have a bunch of people get together in the 80s and talk about some synthetic drugs that are being passed around, but mostly it's about from the time, of Hoffman and all of that to 1970, and that's when it cuts off. And in terms of pharmacology, what happened is that they passed a law against LSD in 1966, but they forgot to make the precursor illegal, which is lysergic acid monohydrate. So in Storming Heaven, it's documented that LSD, lysergic acid monohydrate, was bought up by Owsley. There was about 1 kilogram of it bought up. And when Owsley went to prison in 1968, he had 2 assistants, Timothy Scully and Nicholas Sand, who continued to disseminate it until about 1969 or 1970, when that supply of lysergic acid went away. Well, at that point, there's a book that was recently issued. There's 2 books that are relevant here that are just kind of arcane, historical. One of them is called The Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and it's the history of a group of people in Laguna Beach who were led by Timothy Leary when he came east, which believed that LSD was a sacramental drug. And another book that was published called The Secret History of LSD, which mainly focuses in on a fellow named Ronald Starks, who was a European and said to be a double or a triple agent. Starks he showed up at, Owsley would never deal with the Brotherhood because he felt they were too flaky. He would deal with the Hells Angels because they kept tight discipline. But the Brotherhood were messianic, and they wanted to spread LSD everywhere, and so Owsley would never deal with them. But Starks in 1970 showed up on the Brotherhood ranch and opened up a suitcase, and there was 1 kilogram of LSD. And that was as much as Owsley had made in the previous 4 years. And he said there's a lot more where this came from. Well, the year before that, he had made a small batch with a Scottish chemist and sent it to Canada, and nobody liked it. Then he perfected a technique for making ergotamine tartrate into LSD on a very large scale, and set up a factory in France and started churning out huge quantities of LSD by the what had previously been known. I mean, 1 kilogram was equal to probably about, 3/4 of all the LSD that had been taken up till then. So then that was sent into the United States in 250 microgram doses, and it got into the hands of many, many people who didn't know what to do with it. Who didn't have those guidelines that Leary and his friends had passed around. And so there was a lot of people, and a second thing about this LSD was that it was different in its effects. And there's still a lot of questions about why, but there was a part of the recipe is it didn't matter what you did at the end. If there was a lot of stuff left over, just leave it in there, and it won't have any effect because LSD is so powerful. And we know now, I just interviewed a biochemist named David Nichols, who's a professor of medicinal chemistry at Purdue University, and they've found 15 different receptor sites for LSD. So it's a very complex effect that it has. And when contaminants, are even maybe at very small quantities, produce different sorts of effects. And so the next thing that happened was we started seeing that dosages on the streets were cut by about 1/5. So instead of getting 250 micrograms, you were more likely to get 50 or 60. And so if you took 1 dose, which most people do, you got a mild high, and so LSD went from being a self-actualizing tool to being a party drug. You took 1 hit of it and you got a slight buzz, but you couldn't feel the impurities at that level unless you took maybe 5 or 10 of them. And then you could feel that this was different than the Osley stuff you took or the Sandoz or whatever. And from that point forward to this very day, most of the LSD is like that. And I started accumulating information about that from about 1973 and published a series of articles about that. The last one that I published was in 1977 in one of the magazines I published in High Times, and it was called LSD Purity, and it's on the web. And I'm doing a LSD Purity Revisited because I've gathered a lot more material since then. But at that point, there was such a great reverence for the psychedelic movement, for the learnings that we had, that people were looking around to try to find other ways to produce an experience equivalent to LSD because they knew that they were looking for something. Now, experiences in LSD come in different varieties. In fact, there was a book called The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, which was a pun on, or a twist on William James' The Varieties of Religious Experience, that was authored by Ariel Masters and Gene Houston, and which describes a series of experiments that were conducted in New York City in the early and mid-60s with 267 subjects given pure LSD. Now the LSD was part of this, what my friend Peter Stafford calls the magic gram. There was a gram of LSD that Dr. John Beresford wrote to Hoffman for. He said he was going to be doing some rat experiments. And Hoffman sent him a gram of LSD, and he took half of it and gave it to an English fellow, kind of a roguish fellow, named Michael Hollingshed. And I have the pleasure to know both John Beresford and Michael Hollingshed. And Hollingshed was quite a fun guy and very intellectual and so forth, but kind of a roguish character. And he actually wrote a book which is also on the web called The Man Who Turned on the World. And in a sense he did, because he went to England and he was very much a part of the Carnaby psychedelic scene. He turned on the dentist, Dr. Roberts, the one who gave the Beatles LSD. He Turned on Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary has a very famous account in his High Priest of how he took this LSD from Michael Hollingshead, and he never would go back to this pussycat psilocybin they were using. That LSD was something far more powerful and far more significant, knocked him out of his never could go back to his old roles as a Harvard professor, that he had to move on. Now, the magic gram got around, and 267 people took some of that in this experiment, and I like the book. I recommend Storming Heaven. I also recommend Varieties of Psychedelic Experience. I'm not sure if it's still in print. I didn't check, but I think that it might have recently gone back. And of course you can get it used at Amazon. But it has 4 different levels of the experience that people had. In other words, some people would have a very superficial experience, and this is all in the same dosage, with the same type of setting and so forth. Some people would have what they call just a sensory or recollective level, and then other people would have a higher experience, which they called the analytical level, which was still kind of on a, I guess you call it left-brained or rational, level, but a higher appreciation of things. And then there was an archetypal level, which was kind of like the archetypes of Jung or the symbols of the second Bardo in Tibetan Buddhism or something like that. And then finally, some people would have what they called the integral experience, which has also been called the clear light of the void, cosmic consciousness, the unitive experience, has a variety of names. And it was those types of people who seemed to get the most benefit from the drug. This was later observed in the studies that was done after LSD was made illegal by some of the researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health, which were allowed to continue some of the protocols that they had started before LSD was made illegal. You see, there was thousands of studies that were done until LSD was made illegal. All of a sudden, they yanked it back. And so all the studies were cut off, but there was a few studies that were allowed to continue. One of them, and they were at Bethesda, Maryland. And one of them, they were under the Dr. Kurland. There was a fellow named Walter Pankey, who unfortunately died in a scuba diving accident maybe 2 or 3 years after he started his work. And he wrote some brilliant papers about the effects of LSD. And then also Dr. Stanislav Grof, who came from Czechoslovakia. And both of them came to the conclusion that the best use of LSD was what they called the psychedelic therapy model. They had 2 models for the use of LSD. The first was a psycholytic model, where you would give LSD a number of times in low doses and employ some sort of psychodynamic or psychoanalytical process-oriented interpretation on the experiences. And then the second type was with high doses of LSD administered maybe once or twice in a Hubbard room, with the object of somebody having this integrative, unitive experience. And what they found was that was the thing that really helped people more than anything else. Although how much, I talked yesterday about how much these things can change people over time. You look at McLaughlin's work, Dr. McLaughlin, who did a lot of the work with LSD and personality. He died in a mountain climbing accident about 10 years ago, but I knew him also, and he did work where he would also use the Hubbard room and give people the integral experience, and then he would test them on a series of personality scales before the experience, right after, and then at periods of time, and saw how their personalities would change. And what he noted mostly was that they would migrate back they would change radically at the beginning, and then they would migrate back toward what they were before over time. The only exception he found to that were people who had what he called the conversion experience, who adopted a different lifestyle or different way of living. Say you joined a Buddhist monastery after you took LSD. You were a stockbroker. Well, some of these personality changes would be reinforced by your new lifestyle and would persist longer that way. So the external influences of the world had a tendency of eroding any kind of changes in the personality over time. Now the first use of LSD therapeutically, we talked about kind of tangentially earlier, was by Humphrey Osmond in Canada. And a little known secret of that is that he was administering high doses of LSD to people to try to produce a spiritual experience and change alcoholics. They found that when alcoholics had peak experiences, that many times they would give up alcohol. And this was later validated in studies that was done at National Institute of Mental Health. But anyway, one of his subjects was Bill W., the founder of AA. And Bill W. had been discharged. He was actually a patient of Carl Jung in the 40s. And Carl Jung kicked him out, said, I don't want to work with you anymore. The best cure for dipsomania is religomania. Dipsomania being alcoholism, religomania being the love of the integral clear light experience, religomania. And so Bill W. eventually, so the big religious experience that all of the AA people read about in their little book was given by Osmond. And in any event, there were these studies that continued on and looked at the efficacy of using LSD, but after 1970, the availability to researchers diminished. The government really made it very stringent for any new protocols to be opened up, and also the availability of really good pure LSD diminished, and so people started looking in other directions. One of the biggest breakthroughs was a publication of a book by two people who wrote a book under the fictional name Asen Oric, the Psilocybin Mushroom Grower's Guide, but that was Terence and Dennis McKenna. And the book told people how to cultivate psilocybin mushrooms and gave them a chance to have a somewhat reliable psychedelic compound, but it never really replaced LSD in a major way, because now why was it that LSD produced such a big revolution and produced this big psychedelic revolution when in 1897 Arthur Hefner had synthesized mescaline, and mescaline sat around, was available to people for good 50 years or 60 years before LSD was around. Well, yeah, a few intellectuals took it. Some people say that there was a group around Jung and Hesse and Paul Klee, the famous artist, and so forth. But when they gave it to John Paul Sartre, he wrote Nausea, and that's probably the reason why the nausea was a predominant effect of mescaline. Also, hot and cold flashes. You had to take a lot of it. The dosage of LSD that's effective is very small compared to the dosage of mescaline. Psilocybin. There was some synthetic psilocybin. You never saw mushrooms in the 60s very much. There were synthetic psilocin tablets, and I had a chance to take some of these a few times, and they were somewhat like LSD, but LSD always had a little bit more depth than the other ones. And then people started looking around to find substitutes. There was belief among the young people that there was these truths involved in this counterculture. For years, the Grateful Dead culture kept the hippie movement alive. They were kind of like a cultural touchstone to this time. You know, they dressed the same, they did the same things, and so forth. And there was, you know, to this very day, there's an entheogen movement that's kind of blossomed up. The amount of books published has increased very greatly in the last 5 or 10 years. We in Santa Cruz have been doing an organization called various names. It started out as Linkage, later became the Psychedelic Education Center, and are now the Island Foundation, that have been putting out information about psychoactive compounds, trying to put out good information. But we were kind of the victims of the war on drugs. I mean, in a way, the government's war on drugs really worked on the psychedelic people. It didn't work on people who took heroin. I mean, the heroin's 10 times cheaper than it was when they started the war on drugs, and 10 times as pure. And I think I said the same thing yesterday about cocaine, but availability of psychedelic compounds is they've almost disappeared from the face of the earth, unless you try legal synthetic compounds that don't seem to have the same kind of profile as LSD, or whether you have to put a lot of work and go see a shaman somewhere or something like that. It can't be a mass movement. You know, the best minds of our generation were snatched away from using LSD. They take a hit of blotter LSD and they say, this is all there is to it, you know, get a job at Yahoo. You know, it's not the same. The psychedelic movement really ended 30 years ago, but people, for the most part, in the movement don't know that it ended. Okay, so we're in a situation now where, you know, I could never have imagined when I first smoked a joint in 1967 or took LSD in 1968 that 35 years later that, you know, it would be worse, the laws against LSD would be worse, the laws against marijuana wouldn't be that much better, and that we would be in the situation that we were in. We thought that things were going to change really fast, but when communism as a threat went away, the government had to find a substitute, and they picked on drugs. And the war on drugs is the war on drug users. And there's quite a bit of money behind this war on drugs. Pharmaceutical companies who don't want to see it as a therapeutic tool. There's the prison systems that make a lot of money. There's the DEA and the government agencies who make a lot of money. Government is even allowed to name what drugs are illegal now. They don't even have to pass a law against them. They just publish it. And they have the new Analogs Act that they passed in '86, which makes anything that's similar to a known psychoactive compound automatically illegal, which has really strange implications. I mean, for instance, we have chemicals in our brain which are similar to psychoactive chemicals like DMT. Rick Strassman, in his new book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, points out that we have drugs in our brain that are real close to DMT, so theoretically the government could go around seizing our brains and saying, oh yeah, we got DMT. Or there's spices like nutmeg or mace that have things that are like MDMA or MDA. So they could go into the spice cabinet and say, hey, you got MDA-like compounds, or substantially, the term is substantially similar in the language that they use. So the government has passed a series of more and more stringent laws. The latest victim, you know, as I talked about yesterday, they have to have a drug every decade or every half decade or so. You know, it was in In the 60s it was LSD, in the 70s it was cocaine, in the 80s it was crack, you know, and 90s it was amphetamines and smokable amphetamines, and now it's ecstasy or MDMA, but they always have to have something new that they can have a big to-do about, and ecstasy's it right now. But the result has been that there are a lot of people who really want to have these kinds of experiences, a lot of young people who never had the opportunity and maybe even didn't know they didn't have the opportunity to have these experiences. But I said in my description of my lecture that I was going to try to take a little excursion to a possible future in which this particular situation doesn't exist anymore. Well, in my my book, Ecstasy, the MDMA Story, I have a last chapter. It's called The Future of Ecstasy, or something like that. And I talk about some of the ideas that came up as early as the 1950s. There was a Dr. Van Regen who gave a paper at one of these CIA-sponsored Josiah Macy conferences about setting up centers where people could take psychedelics. One of the things that I feel about them is that you know, one, it's been shown that the most effective use, although people have other ideas and certainly there are other modalities for using them, that one of the most effective things is giving people a very high dose, that people be given like a retreat, you know, a vacation from their ordinary life for a week or a week and a half, where they can take the session under careful you know, supervision in a very beautiful place with pure material and trained guides, a psychedelic education center, a psychedelic research center, so forth. These things would be licensed, there would be trained guides and so forth. Now, which drugs would be used? Well, I've been talking about LSD. The research with LSD continued on after they discovered LSD. There were about 20 other compounds that were discovered in the 1950s that were related to LSD. Some of them popped up in news stories like ALD 52, but a lot of them were unknown. Some of them are almost as powerful as LSD. But the research kind of stopped, but about 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, David Nichols, who heads the Hefner Institute, got a protocol to do work with rats and has continued on research with lysergic acid derivatives. And he's not allowed to give them to humans or to talk about what they do, but he has discovered a whole variety of compounds related to LSD, some of them 15 times more powerful. Now, there are other compounds related to phenethylamines. There's a drug, I don't know if people have heard about it, called 2CB. Has anybody ever heard of 2CB? Well, and then there's another drug that was famous in the 60s as a kind of a bad thing. It got out of the laboratory called DOM, which was STP. They called it STP, and they started marketing it in 20 times the dose that people should take. DOM, DOB, 2CB, they're all phenethylamines, and there are phenethylamines that are very, very powerful. They're powerful, you know, at the 100 microgram level, or even some more powerful than LSD, but they're powerful, but their effects are different, and the nuances of them are less subtle. People who, even the rats, you know, who are trained to discriminate can tell there's a difference between them and the lysergic acid group. And, I've been told, kind of off the record, that some of these compounds are interesting hybrids that are like mixes of MDMA and LSD together and so forth. This is a very fertile area for future research in terms of effective psychoactive compounds that could be used in a legal or semi-legal context. I mean, no matter what, eventually it seems to me that drugs will have to be legalized. It may be 100 years, but when we do, this particular area, this group. And now another thing that I did was, I was one of the early people who researched MDMA. And early on, I was reading a very dry paper by Gary Fisher in Psychedelic Review called On Dosage Level, and it gave the different dosage levels of psilocybin, mescaline, and LSD. And as an aside, he had to give LSD to mental patients, and a lot of times they came in there with a bad attitude, they were not the proper set. So he would pre-dose them with Ritalin. And Ritalin kind of gives you euphoria, and the chances of them having a positive experience just goes way up. Well, I said to myself, wow, if Ritalin can do it, MDMA could do it. So I started doing some experiments. This is, back when MDMA was still legal in 1980, 81. There had been some studies done with 2CB, which is it's a phenethylamine which acts for about 5 hours, but it's very tricky, much trickier than you read in the literature, and illegal now, along with almost everything. But there was, for instance, in The Gateway to the Heart, the book which was by Sophia Addison and Ralph Metzner, which has a number of the early MDMA experiences, what we called Adam back then. And a lot of those were in combination with 2CB. Well, I tried it with LSD and found tremendously good results, because a lot of times people go into an LSD session with a great deal of anxiety or trepidation, and it can produce a positive mindset, and oftentimes pushes LSD in a good direction. Now, everybody knows that whatever experience you have, there's no such a thing as a bad trip or a good trip in the real sense. That you learn from all your experiences. Making mistakes is often the best way to learn, but having these powerful, integral experiences is really a good thing, and taking MDMA simultaneously with LSD may be a future modality for its use, because it increases the chances that people will have a good experience. Okay. Now we talked about the Eleusinian Mysteries and these guided sessions. Well, that goes to the idea of programming sessions. In fact, there's been treatises on the guide and what the guide is supposed to do during an LSD session or an MDMA session. And there's also programming guides for how to set up the right types of, play the right music at the right time, or set up the right environment to have the Hubbard room or the flowers or this or that. Well, if you go back in history, one of the earliest examples of programming with drugs was kind of this sinister MK Ultra CIA-ish type of thing. It was the assassin-i-sabath, and the term assassin comes from what assassin-i-sabath did with hashish. What he would do is he would go and he'd Shanghai some poor Arab somewhere, and he'd bring him back to his center, and he would give him a bunch of hashish, and he'd put him into an environment where he thought he was in heaven. And then he would, tell him that he could go to the heaven if he went out and killed people. So that's how they program people into becoming assassins. The CIA, you know, were actually looking at things like that too back at MK Ultra. Besides, you know, using it as a truth serum, they were also looking at it as a metaprogramming tool. So what would be a future use for this type of thing? Well, we could have Neo-Eleusinian Mysteries. We could I was in Las Vegas. I go to Las Vegas a lot because my mother lives there. And we've gone to the Caesar's Palace, and they have a wonderful, what do they call that, Cinemax, or I can't remember the name of it, but it's virtual reality. What's that? IMAX, yeah. IMAX ride, Trip to Atlantis, which only lasts about 10 minutes. But it's very realistic, and it comes with this, you know, the seats shake, and you have controls and all of that. Well, imagine creating an 8-hour program like the Eleusinian Mysteries and giving it along with LSD and maybe MDMA or one of these variants of LSD. You could do some kind of programming like that rather than laying people flat on their back and putting blindfolds on, or you know, the other variants of it. You could program various kinds of experiences. You could program a Neo-Eleusinian mystery that guided people to the answers of the Oracle of the Delphi. There's many things, many ways we can combine. Technology doesn't have to be a bad thing. Drugs don't have to be a bad thing or a good thing. It's the way that we use them. Erich Fromm's classic book, Escape from Freedom, where he talks about the difference between authoritarian and humanistic psychotherapy. You know, the authoritarian psychiatrist in the 1950s was trying to control his patients and make them conform, and the humanistic psychologist was trying to empower them and give them the ability to make up their own minds, to think for themselves. And so combining ancient wisdom, combining the Eleusinian mysteries or some kind of shamanic model with new psychedelic compounds or maybe old psychedelic compounds, setting up centers with people who are knowledgeable, in which there's no aura of illegality, in which everything is on the up and the up, could, you know, within the boundaries of how much these kinds of experiences can change personality. And I talked about that yesterday, about nature versus nurture, and about how some of our temperaments are pretty solid, that we could produce a new kind of therapies or new kinds of self-actualization tools that we can only conceive of right now. So that's how I, you know, if we were to take a thought experiment into a possible future. Another thing that I found was that one of the, remember when we talked about McLaughlin's work about how people's personalities migrated back unless they had a conversion experience. Well, the culture that we live in reinforces our view of the world and our personality and so forth. And so one of the things I did, I was, you know, started out studying political science, and I ended up almost finishing my doctorate in psychology. And now I see it as a system, and that it's not just internal work or the way that the system is set up, but the whole relationships between these things. And so about 10 years ago, I started a group called Island Foundation, named after Aldous Huxley's novel Island. And we published 9 publications. This is our latest publication, Island Views #6, and we did 3 magazines. And Island has a national and worldwide membership. We have a website at www.island.org. For those of you who want to reference a lot of the material that I have, we have a Voyages Elsewhere section that has links to hundreds and hundreds of other sites. and it's all cataloged. We just now launching what I call the Psychedelic Sanctuary Project, and it's based on hexagram 33 of the I Ching retreat. It's to create a retreat someplace in the world where psychedelic folks can get together and set up maybe something like Esalen, where people can take psychedelics legally and use them in conjunction with growth therapy techniques. A place where researchers can conduct research without the stipulations of government sanctions and so forth. Perhaps even a Huxley experiment where we try new models of living together. So basically this issue that I just published is kicking off our Psychedelic Sanctuary Project to raise capital to research and to find some place in the world where we can do that, perhaps an island far from the political atmosphere of the northern and western hemispheres. So that's the end of my talk. I want to take some questions. I'm sure that I've talked a long time and some people have some things to ask me. Please step up to the microphone, if you will. And
same first question as yesterday.
What's that?
Where can I get some?
Where can I get some? Oh, that was the question that I didn't, that was the question that I told you that everybody asked me at the beginning of all my MDMA sessions. Well, the answer really is I ask you that, where can I get some? I actually, I had written this purity piece, right? And shortly after I wrote the piece, I got interested in MDMA, and it took me in a different direction. And so I was criticized an awful lot for the piece. I've done a lot of subsequent research which has reinforced my belief. But about 7 years ago, somebody came to me with a source of pharmaceutical LSD, which just ran out about 2 months ago. And it was like taking a voyage into the 60s. It was so different than any LSD that I'd had since the 60s that I knew that my purity thing was true in there. I knew it was true. And I hadn't written much about it for a long time. I hadn't spoken much about it for a long time, but I know that that a lot of the LSD isn't good. Now my LSD supply has run out, and I don't know where to get it. I mean, it's very difficult. And so I ask you, turn me on. Okay, next question.
Well, I'm going to start with several comments. First of all, my drug experience amounts to one joint.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And I didn't like it, it burnt my throat.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, though, in my library, I got a copy of Psychedelic Review, Volume 1, Issue 1. And how did I get that? I don't know. I think that's probably the same reason I'm here. But for the past 10 years, I've done holotropic breath work, discovered or worked on by Stan Groff as a regular practice.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about this retreat, Jack Kornfield and Stan Groff this very week have a retreat, altered state of consciousness using meditation and holotropic breath work. And every so often, people show up at holotropic breath work coming from an LSD experience, and they don't seem to come back. Have you got any insight of what the difference is between
the difference, I took a 30-day workshop with Stan Groff at Esalen back in the 80s, and it included 2 holotropic sessions per week for the period of time we were there. And at the end, I had an LSD session, and I can tell you, that the LSD session was far more profound than any of the holotropic work. But, you know, people differ greatly. For instance, in psychology, we say that about 15% of the population are fantasy prone. And that's a kind of a good thing in a way, and sometimes a bad thing. It's bad in that they join cults a lot. But it's good in the sense that whenever you have a workshop and people do things, they're the people who have the experiences. In terms of psychology and the Stanford hypnotizability scale, they'd be up there in 24 or something like that. Anything that they're guided through or suggested, they experience, and they experienced it in all the different dimensions. And one of the ways that holotropic breathwork works is through that suggestibility. That's what I came to the conclusion of because I saw the way it was set up. It was set up with, we had a session before where people were told what they were going to experience, and some people had it and some people didn't, and the people who didn't have it there was pressure put on them to want to have it, and for some people it was very, very effective, and for other people it had no effect at all. Stan was driven out of using LSD work because he had so many problems at Esalen with people who had accidents, and he couldn't continue anymore there. He eventually had to leave. He was very courageous. He would have seminars every year where people would have, surreptitious sessions and so forth, and eventually some people had accidents and he had to leave. I believe in an eclectic approach to altered states. I believe that we should use what works. If we can combine, the IMAX, Eleusinian Mystery, binaural driving, holotropic breathing, and aura tuning, and everything together, the sum is greater than the whole of, than the sum of its parts. The whole is greater, and so you can combine synergistically various techniques. I mean, when you take ancient techniques, ancient models of consciousness, and combine them with new insights, you get more than just what you got at the beginning. Does that help at all? I didn't answer your question, or?
It's a start.
It's a start?
The only comparison that I had is, over the years I've observed people as a sitter in holotropic breath work, and I also seen some of videotapes of what Stan did when he was working with people who were critically ill.
Uh-huh.
And when I observed it from the outside, the only difference I could see is that the experiencer under the LSD session was able to talk about his experience and communicate, and that bring you out of the experience of holotropic breath. But that's just from outside. I haven't had any experience.
Uh-huh. Well, you see, the communication of the psychedelic experience is a funny thing. William James came up with 5 characteristics for the mystical experience. And one of them was ineffability, the inability to express it with words. Timothy Leary in Etc. magazine published there was a special issue on communication. He wrote an essay called Communication of the Psychedelic Experience, in which he tried to show how there might be ways of doing it. But, whenever we use, it's like Lao Tzu said, when we name the Tao, it's no longer the Tao that can't be named. It's named. And from the Tao comes the yin and the yang and so forth. So as we use language, we divide the world up. And it's very difficult to bring experiences which are so multidimensional and so multisensory into a verbal description. It can be done, and it's fun to try to do it. There's people who've made movies, people who, a lot of the psychedelic cinema and everything were attempts to try to show what some of this was like. Okay?
As someone who has been since the psychedelic movement ended, quite a long time after the psychedelic movement ended. And obviously I can't say that I've had the same psychedelic experience because obviously I've been dealing with the superior LSD and may not have taken a dose sufficient to have had a true trip or anything. But
well, wait a minute. Can I stop you there? Okay.
Sure.
There's probably exceptions to what, I made this big broad generality, but there are probably exceptions. There's probably some small, chemist somewhere who spend a lot of time, doing everything right, and they make a batch of LSD and it gets out and people take it. What I'm trying to do is say that for the majority of people, for the average, like a high school student or a college student who gets his hit of blotter acid or his hit of window pane, for those people, the availability is poor. Occasionally, if you happen to be really into it and into the scene and you make the right connection, yeah, maybe there is some pure LSD there, but the amount of it isn't very significant compared to what's not good.
I wasn't really disagreeing with your point necessarily, obviously, I'm somewhat of an exception in that we don't have a currently large psychedelic movement going on like we did in the late 60s. But the point I wanted to make was, one tab of the acid that I've been taking and people I know have been taking isn't a very significant dose. But a lot of people who you talk to about, there's a lot of people taking acid still. Certainly, people I hang out with and the people I run into, it seems like there's a lot of it going on still. But
Right.
a lot of it is sort of, it's for, you take one tab for a party or whatever.
Right.
And a lot of people aren't aware of, that they can have these sort of deeper experiences. And a lot of people aren't aware that they need to be taking more than one tab and that if they want to have these deeper experiences, they should do.
Right.
So it might be a matter of just sort of educating people and sort of having more information out there about what the psychedelic experience is. Because what you're saying about the two, how you get to take 5 or 6 tabs or something, get the same effect one tab in the 60s, that's news to me, and as I said, I've hung out with some people I'm very interested in, I've been reading all about it.
Yeah.
But, a lot of people don't know this at all. So it might be that the key to sort of reinvigorating the psychedelic movement is to educate more people about the potential of these drugs, to encourage people to take more significant doses in different settings and so on.
Well, it's interesting because one of the reasons, the number of bad trips declined in the early 70s. And the main reason that was cited by the media was because the dosages were cut. They said, we don't get so many bad trips in the emergency room anymore because people are only getting 60 mics now. And it did cause a decline in emergency room admissions and people having bad experiences. But on the other side of it, if they took 4 or 5 of them, they might get, some of these impurity effects, and the impurity effects might be such that it would prevent them from realizing some of the most subtle potentials that LSD has. So, I'm all for the education again. I'm actually going to rewrite LSD Purity and try to keep making the point that the psychedelic movement doesn't exist anymore, because there's a lot of people out there, and the young people don't want to hear it. There's a whole group of young people, the people who read TRP magazine, the people on a number of news groups and so forth, the people who have sites on the internet, and they don't want to hear that there's some factor called purity. They want to think that the LSD they're taking is the same LSD that I'm taking, and if I say that I took something better, it sounds like I'm bragging that I'm better than them. And I don't do it for that reason. I wish that, that it was all the same, and I wish that it was only social reasons that people's experiences changed. I wish that it was that way, but it's not. And so I've got to, get this information out there, and I'm going to start doing that. I just basically stepped back for a long time from writing because the psychedelic movement is so politicized, and there's so much bad vibes in it. When I was in the 60s, all the hippies were very close-knit, group of people who all were very loving and very forgiving and very kind to each other. It's not the same group of people that exist in 2001. They're very mean as a rule. And so they are. And it's a small market, and a lot of people are in it for the money, and they want to sell their thing, and there's not a lot of people to sell it to, and so they want to get everybody else and say that they don't know anything. It's not a huge market, you know. If it was a bigger market, then the people would be more cooperative. It's like economics. And it's unfortunate because these are really important issues to people like us. You are my community. You know, you're part of the island. And, you know, I want to see us be united, especially when there's a war on us. So that's how I feel about it. I cannot understand, you know, how the level of discourse has come to where it is now. Any more questions?
Hi, first of all, thank you for putting up a question I've had since the 60s. Ours really was extraordinary.
Yeah, well, I got to do a 3.5-hour interview with him. Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, the LSD produced, I mean, it's been a question to me ever since, because it wasn't really as good as I thought it was.
It was.
I'm going to go ahead, because I didn't have enough access to enough of it to compare and swap and whatever. But anyway, thank you for the purity and enlightenment on that. Houston Smith, the other day, was puzzling. He was saying, he says it's still a mystery to him, and there's no clarity to him about how so few molecules of this particular substance can give you access to such, you know, godly experiences. Do you have anything to say on that?
How do just a group of molecules?
Yeah,
Well, how does a group of molecules have consciousness?
Yeah, well,
That's what our brains are. How does it develop becoming a little node of God, of the whole universe? You know, when we developed consciousness, we became a little, you know, it's like the Grateful song, Dead song, we are the eyes of the world. We're the eyes of the universe. And our brains do it all. So, you know, I'm not a dualist. You know, I'm kind of Adva Vedanta or whatever. I'm not really religious, but I believe that there's really no separation between matter and spirit, really, that it's all one, and that at different levels, you know, molecules and neurons can be at another level spiritual and cosmological. So I don't see any distinction between them. People are, you know, ever since Descartes, you know, there's been this split between, you know, matter and spirit. Let's heal the split. Let's bury it with the 20th century and realize that it's all part of the same thing.
It just seems so strange after so many thousands of learned people for so many hundreds of years had the experience of the Eleusinian Mysteries, and that other centers like Eleusis were not established, and that I can't think of any other institution like that, for example, in the Far East. Well, I've heard things about some, and it just seems that this experience has disappeared for thousands of years. I did also hear something about the pure beer laws in Germany were passed so that people would not make mushroom beer.
I don't know anything about that.
Christian Rauch? All right.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting, yeah. Well, I could imagine them, you know, there's been laws against every drug. I think there was laws where if you drank coffee, they would cut your fingers off at one time.
But the thing is that, you know, you can't keep a secret like acid, or mushrooms for very long. I'm just surprised that people just didn't establish their own centers like at Eleusis.
Well, they were able to, the government was able to do a good job of stamping it out and creating a lot of disinformation. In fact, most of the people, when they refute my purity thing, they point to the DEA site. The DEA is producing disinformation to try to make people think that you know, that nothing's changed, that they have access, that the government did a good job of stamping out the movement. They certainly made it, the media made it almost an indelible mark on the public consciousness about it. Whenever you mention, psychoactive drugs or LSD, people immediately think about Charlie Manson or people jumping out of buildings or something like that. That's something that's going to be very, very difficult to eradicate from public consciousness. You can't and that's why I said that LSD in a way was a sacrificial lamb to the Vietnam War, because the media had to do such a number on it, had to do such a damaging attack on it, that they, and continue to do so, that makes it very difficult to do this kind of work.
Did the Christians, when they oppressed the Eleusinian Mysteries, did they have any writings about
Well, there was one little variant of it. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but you remember that Socrates came back and he taught his students, know thyself. And there's a story that goes that the Oracle of Delphi, that's what they got at the end of the Eleusinian Mysteries, was that the Oracle of Delphi would say, know thyself. And when he came back to from his Eleusinian voyage, he was told by the elders not to teach the young people the secret. And he continued to do so, and he got locked up and given hemlock. So it's the same thing like Galileo or Copernicus or anybody who had a special insight,
What do you think the relationship is right now with this psychopharmacology industry, the drugs that are legalized that have to do with psychotherapy, like Prozac and other drugs that are sort of very low level? From what I've read, I have friends who are on various different kinds of drugs that keep their behavior the same as it was before, without any of the sort of feelings associated with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, there's a really interesting website that if people ever have a chance to go to, it's www.headweb.com, Headweb, Hedweb, and it's put out by a guy named Simon Powell, and he has one very interesting description of every psychopharmaceutical compound, legal or illegal, and how they relate. And he has also on it a book that he wrote called The Hedonic Imperative. He believes that our future destiny is to be in a higher, happier, altered state of consciousness all the time. And it can be achieved through a variety of techniques, including drugs, genetics, genetic engineering, other new technologies. And he discusses the various forms of new psychiatric medications which have become more sophisticated. The thing about them is that they're imperfect. They always have side effects. They never really cure anything. They're kind of like Band-Aids. It's like taking aspirin when you have a headache. It doesn't, necessarily cure the headache, but it makes the symptoms diminish. And so there's more money in it for pharmaceutical companies to have drugs that you have to take every day than drugs that you just take once in a while.
Well, and the question also is that these drugs, a lot of these people I know are in therapy, a lot of young people are in therapy and are on Prozac, young adults. They don't seem to be having breakthroughs. They're actually changing their consciousness or behavior. It just seems to be a continuation, and they feel better about the behavior that they're enacting. What I mean is like rampant consumerism, the belief systems of working within the dominant paradigm of capitalism or hyper-capitalism that's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Corporate global.
Yeah, well, that's what I said is stacked up against the war on drugs. There's this huge megalith. It includes the people who want to run these private prisons and have labor for $3 an hour. It includes the DEA. It includes the police system. Probably a lot of the police don't want to enforce drug laws, but a lot of them, they make their money at it. The prison system, the DEA, the FDA, Congress, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the pharmaceutical companies, all of these are huge economic forces that don't want to see any change. They love the drug war, and the politicians like it because they have a scapegoat. They can say, oh yeah, it's the drug dealers, they're doing everything bad. They haven't had much effect as far as solving the problems, and they've actually created illegal money that's channeled off into people like terrorists because they've made drugs artificially high in price, the ones that we don't want to take mostly. But that's what we're up against. I mean, here, I'm funded the island with $25,000 a year, and these guys are funded with $25 billion a year. We can just be a very little small voice against a huge megalith that's pumping out tons of misinformation. There's in the schools they have the what are those called, the DARE programs, and just so much money is being channeled into anti-drug propaganda that it's very difficult to get this kind of message out, and very dangerous.
I've had many friends have profound healings, both psychologically and physical, with the use of good use of LSD, MDMA, or psilocybin, etc. But what I'd like to know is, are there any negative side effects over long-term use of these substances, or anything like that you've ever heard of or noticed? Aside from
I discussed MDMA yesterday pretty much at length in my lecture, and I said that the answer is we don't know on MDMA. As far as LSD goes, I think at the beginning of this lecture I said that that there's a lot of people who shouldn't take it, and some of those people are people with predispositions to mental disorders. I know people who've taken LSD and it's triggered off long-term problems. Sidney Cohen, who wrote The Beyond Within, believed that it might even produce long-term problems in people who didn't have a predisposition for mental disorders. I don't know about that, but it's a possibility. So we don't have good screening techniques. We don't have a lot of money to research good screening techniques. But we do know that people who are pretty well grounded, who have less of a need for self-control, who are fairly stable, who haven't shown, don't have a history of mental disorders and so forth, they're more likely candidates for psychedelics. But they're not without risks, and there are going to be casualties, but don't forget, people drive and there's millions of traffic accidents a year. People drink and there's, many accidents. There's something called informed risk, or, cost to risk benefit and so forth. They're not without harm. They're not harmless. One should take them with reverence and with caution and with knowledge.
I guess I'm kind of more asking along the lines of physical side effects.
Oh, physical side effects. Well, are you talking about LSD itself? Okay. Well, one of the things about LSD is that there's two points about it. One is that with pure LSD, there is some very mild physical effects that are noted. Like, for instance, sometimes people feel like a metallic taste in their mouth right at the very beginning. And also, there's some increase in heart rate, but very little. And because LSD is so, the amount that you take is so small, the amount of LSD, for instance, if you take 150 micrograms, only 1,000th of that goes through the filter from the blood into the brain. the blood-brain barrier. And of that, only a very few molecules actually intercepts with the receptor sites. It's almost, compared to a drug like aspirin, where there's 1,000 times as much more physical. MDMA is much more physical. LSD is very non-physical. And one of the things that's really noteworthy about the purity thing is that the purer it is, the less physical it feels. And so, for instance, one thing I noted about very pure LSD is that you could hardly detect that you were on anything until it finally came on all the way, and then you were just like on, instant on. So there is in some people who are, like everybody's different, and there are idiosyncratic reactions. There are some people who will have every physical side effect in the world on it. And some of it, and a lot of that is psychological. It's not physical in nature, but it's psychologically caused. You can cause a lot of physical distress just by your own mind.
I guess since my first experience, I've always thought of LSD as being a very powerful tool for personal growth and enlightenment. And I've had a range of variety and experience from going to Epcot Center with a group of my friends or just being alone in a dark room. And my question to you is, do you feel one context compared to the other might lead to a higher state of enlightenment for you personally?
You mean, in terms of context, could you describe that again for me?
So having a lot of stimulus, a lot of sound, a lot of different...
Oh, versus having none?
Being in a dark room where you have sort of...
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what we call by set and setting. And in fact, there was one, like for instance, Terence McKenna in the beginning, he always had the what I call the psychedelic missionary position, which is flat on your back in a dark room. Dr. Groff with his blindfolds and very sensory deprivation, John Lilly with his sensory deprivation tank, all the way to people like Salvador Roquette, who actually try to induce people to freak out by giving them multimedia barrages, which probably at their peak included, the Fourth Reich national anthem and atomic bombs going off and so forth. So there's been every different which way. I would not recommend that, by the way. He got in a lot of trouble with that technique, but he thought it was very effective. And the reason Groff, for instance, believed in the blindfolds was because he felt that most of what we see on psychedelic experiences visually are projections of our own unconscious, so that if we cut off the external stimuli, that we'll be able to have a chance to examine our internal unconscious without projecting it on the outside world and creating a synthesia or combination between the two of them. John Lilly showed that to good effect too. The idea of creating a Neo-Eleusinian mystery with a lot of sensory stuff but aimed at specific cues and specific effects psychologically is an interesting idea. I think that, we really don't know the answers about exactly how it should be done. I think that these are questions that still need to be answered, and certainly the atmosphere hasn't been very good for us to quietly examine these different alternatives. I'd like to see more of that in the future, more research into, good questions rather than whether it causes chromosome breakage, which it doesn't.
Hi, this is a bit off topic.
Last question.
Nothing like a level 4. But have you ever heard of enlightenment intensive?
Enlightenment intensives. Is that a workshop or something?
Well, my experience of it was in a workshop.
Oh, yeah. I used to get the magazine, Avatar.
Is that what it was?
Yeah,
Where you just do,
Right, and you paid like $10,000 and you... Oh, this was a different one?
This is back in 1980. So, but anyway, I think that that was the closest thing that I mean, I did Rob's work,
Uh-huh.
but I think that was kind of the closest thing that I ever came to that took you to such a high level and also produced the visuals.
Uh-huh.
That, and I've never heard about them again. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that the trainers had to pay the $10,000, and then it was cheaper for the people who took it. But there was a magazine called Avatar that had enlightenment intensives, and there's been so many techniques through the years. You know, I've been writing about these things, and I've come across hundreds that have come and gone. What I'm saying is that let's not say one thing's good and another thing's wrong. Let's have an experimental, open-minded approach to combining, to using all the different techniques we have available. So thank you very much for coming. If you're interested in an island, I didn't bring too many of these, but I have a couple, and I'll be doing a book signing outside of my ecstasy book. So thank you very much again.